Professor Garrett, can you see that he could win another term, or do you think he is destined to be a one-term president?
You know, the elections last week were the day after Melbourne Cup Day, or they were in fact with the dateline on the same day. I think if you could get reasonable odds on President Obama, I would bet on him today in 2012 for two reasons. One, it's likely that the economy will recover somewhat from where it is today, and that'll help the president. And the second is that the Republicans really still don't have an attractive candidate. People now talk about Sarah Palin being more likely to be the Republican nominee. I think the Democrats would be quite happy if that happened, because it's very hard to see how Sarah Palin could beat Barack Obama in a general election.
Well, it's interesting because that you mention her, because the momentum for the Republicans really wasn't buoyed substantially by the very loud and numerous rallies run by the Tea Party. Is there a lesson for the Democrats and the President that the Republicans got their supporters to come out and vote a lot more than Democrat supporters seem to come out and vote? Yeah,
it was very interesting. Obama supporters, particularly young people who were so fired up in 2008, were sufficiently depressed with the President that they didn't bother to vote last week. Contrast that with the Republicans, who were angry, so angry that they came out in higher numbers. So obviously turnout is always a big issue in the United States. Will the Democrats try to learn some Republican tactical strategy? I doubt it. I think that the biggest story here was just the two E's, the economy and the sky-high expectations on Obama. So the expectations now will be lower, and you'd expect the economy gradually to come back. That's not helping the Democrats in Congress in 2011, but it may well help Barack Obama in the presidential election in 2012.
All right, let's talk the AUSMIN talks and I guess really the wash-up of that, because Hillary Clinton has now left the country. What did they achieve? Anything substantively? Because we already know that the alliance between Australia and the US is pretty strong.
Yeah, the alliance is rock solid. You know, people are noting the fact that Barack Obama is today in India rather than in Australia, having postponed twice his time in Australia. I think one reason for that is not that Australia is not important to the US, it's the fact that there are no real issues in the relationship, whereas US-India relations have become a little bit strained in the recent past. So what I would look at is the fact that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are going to be spending essentially a week right after these elections in the Asia-Pacific, meeting with all the key bilateral partners of the US, India, Australia, Korea, Japan, but then also participating in Asia-Pacific institution building, and that'll have two elements, the East Asia Summit and also then the G20 and moving towards APEC. So reinforcing alliances and being an active participant in Asian regionalism, I think those are two big themes that we'll see from the Obama administration in the next 2 years.
All right, but out of these talks, do you think, in fact, it benefited the United States more than it benefited Australia? Because we have heard there will be some enhanced presence. Now, whether Australia gets all that, more troops, more ships, more visits, more manoeuvres, all that sort of thing, that benefits the United States. It doesn't necessarily benefit Australia, does it?
Well, I think Australia benefits in a way that's always in the background, but certainly for people who are close to government, it's extraordinarily important. You know, Australia shares communication and intelligence with the United States with an openness that's almost unprecedented, literally, in the world. There are maybe one or two other countries that have as much open access information flow with the US as Australia does.
But meaning we give you all our information, and the United States doesn't necessarily give us its information.
No, actually, it goes the other way, that Australia gets access to American intelligence that very few countries in the world do. You know, it is always this concern in Australia, is it asymmetric? Do we get enough out of the alliance?
Yes, that we're being used, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And you don't think we are?
No, I don't think so. And certainly, again, the closer one gets to anybody in government in Australia, first of all, the more important they see the US alliance as being, and second, they see it as being one from which Australia benefits enormously.
I guess one of the big confirmations out of these talks is the realisation that America has very much engaged with China. Is the China watch becoming an obsession with America? And if it is that warranted?
Well, I think it's becoming an obsession for everybody. These days it's pretty hard to have a sentence in which China doesn't figure somewhere. My view on the US on China policy actually is that you need to distinguish between the kind of sometimes histrionic reactions that come out of Congress and elsewhere and what the administration, what the presidency does. American policy on China, like Australian policy on China, has been very, very stable over a long period of time, 20 or 30 years, and it basically says economic engagement is in our interests, but we want to ensure against the small probability of something bad happening with China, which is why we need to invest in our traditional alliances.
So do you, in your view, do you take the hopeful view of China as certainly being fast-growing, becoming very rich, but essentially a benign force in the future of the world? Or do you take the more sceptical, suspicious view of China?
I'm on the benign side, which really means that you have a faith in the power of economic engagement, not only to increase the economic stakes, sort of economic stakes are high so we can't go to war, but also because Chinese growth is probably the best way forward to get political change in China. The stronger the Chinese middle class is, the more products they're going to buy from the West, but it's probably also likely that the more pressure, internal pressure, there'll be placed on the Chinese regime to liberalise.
All right, we've got to change tack briefly. Afghanistan was a very big topic of discussion, with Mrs Clinton reiterating that US troops could come out of Afghanistan by mid-next year. Now, are you worried about America's pullout, that may create a vacuum into which goes what?
Well, that's a really tough question. I just start by noting it's very interesting that in the United States, and Secretary Clinton mentioned it, the date that everyone talks about is 2011, when Barack Obama is committed to beginning a withdrawal of American troops. If you listen to Julia Gillard or the British government, they talk about 5 years of 10 years of commitment.
10 years Julia Gillard talked about, but not necessarily the beginning of the pullout. But
yeah,
sorry,
so the Obama position is a very difficult one. I think the Obama administration, if it could, would like to draw down from Afghanistan as prudently but as quickly as it can in an environment where the commitment to Afghanistan, at least initially back in 2008, was more a political commitment than a strategic one. Barack Obama had pristine anti-Iraq credentials. He needed to show Americans that he was strong on national security, so he said Afghanistan was the right war. What he's trying to do now is to find an exit path for the US. After 10 years of war, Americans are sick of war, but that doesn't leave a vacuum in Afghanistan. An extraordinarily difficult thing, but you'd expect that the US would lead on this one and Australia will follow. It'd be a peace dividend, after all, for Australia if, let's say, Australian troops could withdraw sooner than the 10 years. Boy, that'd be a win, not a loss for Australia.
All right, we'll leave it there. Professor Garrett, thank you so much for joining us for those insights.